Hi friends. Please subscribe and help me get my first 1,000 subscribers. It's one click for you, but for me it's a huge encouragement and motivation. Thank you to everyone who has already subscribed. I hope you enjoy this story. Let's go. Jack Walker, the son of a strict military man and a quiet, caring Vietnamese housewife, grew up in a small town where his family barely made ends meet. The street they lived on was quiet only at first glance. The cramped neighborhood houses hid their own dramas, scandals, and secret dreams. Jack, as a small and puny boy, had felt like an outsider from an early age. His father, Sergeant Gerald Walker, rarely showed affection. He believed that the best way to raise a real man was through strict discipline. Every morning, Gerald would wake Jack up at 5 o'clock and make him run around the block despite the cold or rain. "Life won't wait for you to get a good night's sleep," he used to say. Jack never complained, even if his legs were jacked up with fatigue after the run. But despite his best efforts, he struggled to find himself in this strict world where more was always demanded of him. His mother, Lynn, seemed to be the complete opposite of his father. Her voice was soft and her gaze always looked for the good in people. She made the best spring rolls in the neighborhood, which made one forget the harsh reality for a moment. However, Lynn couldn't protect Jack from bullying either. Every day he came home from school with new bruises, either physical or emotional. One day at the age of 7, Jack came home later than usual. His face was crying and his shirt was torn. When asked by his father what had happened, he only shrugged. But Gerald wasn't about to let it go unheeded. The next day he took his son to a local dojo that belonged to Mr. Carter, a former karate champion. "This guy will teach you things I can't," Gerald said, clapping Jack on the shoulder. "If you can stand up to him, you can handle anything in life." Mr. Carter was a short but extremely sturdy man with a serious look. There was no fuss in his movements. Every step, every gesture seemed to be well thought out. The first lesson was a real test for Jack. He could not even stand up correctly, and after several falls on the mat was ready to run away. But Mr. Carter, seeing his indecision, stopped the group and turned directly to Jack. "Do you think you're weak?" His voice sounded like a stroke of thunder. "Weakness is not your size or your mistakes. Weakness is when you give up." Those words were the first spark of change for Jack. He didn't give up. Week after week he came to workouts, fell down and got up again. His body grew stronger, his movements more confident, but most importantly he learned to control his anger. Memories of school bullies, his father's scornful looks, or his own fears became fuel for his training. By the age of 9, Jack was able to defend himself against a group of high school students who decided to take away his pocket money. Instead of running, he stood his ground and looking straight into the eyes of the main one of them, said, "Try it." This incident was a turning point. Jack had gained a reputation for being not only a smart guy but a brave one. He was respected even if not always liked. He was no longer afraid to come home with bruises, and his father praised him for the first time. "Not bad. You've finally become a walker." Over the years, Jack not only developed his physical abilities, but also focused on his studies. He was always fascinated by numbers and complex problems that required logic. He graduated from high school with honors, which allowed him to attend a local university to major in programming and business. It was there that he met Sarah. She was sitting on the first desk in the auditorium, preparing for a lecture on corporate strategies. Sarah immediately caught his attention with her sharp mind and confidence. But what impressed Jack the most was her ability to speak as if she knew exactly what she wanted out of life. Their first conversation had taken place in the library, when Jack, tapping his fingers nervously on the table, had plucked up the courage to invite her in for coffee. "Do you want to discuss the lecture?" Sarah asked with a slight smile that embarrassed him more than he expected. "Yes. Well, and no. I think you're an interesting person and I want to get to know you better," Jack replied, feeling his cheeks flaming. Sarah, unexpectedly to him, agreed. Their first meeting lasted almost 3 hours. They discussed not only their studies but also their dreams, fears, and plans for the future. Jack felt as if he had found someone who understood him better than he did. Their relationship grew quickly. Sarah became for him not only his favorite girl, but also a support that helped him believe in himself. After graduating from university, they decided to get married. The wedding was modest, but it didn't matter to them. They both knew that together they could achieve anything. Over time, their lives developed into a neatly organized rhythm. Sarah, with her sharp mind and ambition, was rapidly climbing the career ladder, working in a financial company. Jack, on the other hand, preferred stability. He practiced programming, which allowed him to work from home and spend more time with their son Alex. But shadows began to lurk behind this idol. Sarah was staying late at work more and more often, and Jack, immersed in his daily routine, didn't immediately notice how an invisible wall began to grow between them. Sarah came home late. Her heels thudded on the marble slabs of the office lobby when the security guard noticed her, nodded politely and went back to his monitor. The time was approaching midnight, and her entire day had passed in a constant state of tension. 2 meetings, analyzing contracts, numerous calls, all to keep her company's clients running smoothly. But perhaps most grueling of all was her meeting with Mark Steele. "Are you seriously considering this risk?" Sarah asked, casting him a quick but attentive glance. Mark sat behind a massive desk, relaxed in a leather armchair. His smile was so confident that she felt involuntarily irritated. Her job was to protect her clients from rash financial decisions, not approve questionable deals. But Mark was a man who didn't just expect the world to turn in his direction. He made it happen. "It's not a risk, it's an investment," he said, making a slight gesture with his hand. "And if it is a risk, to me it's justified." Mark was a large man with a charisma that seemed to fill the space around him. His confidence was alluring. As if knowing in advance that every woman entering his office would stare at him a little longer than the others. Sarah had noticed it from the first minute they met, but ignored it, focusing on the case. She opened the file folder once more to focus, but instead of studying the numbers, her thoughts returned to his words. "Are you always this cold-blooded?" Mark asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Sarah looked up. His tone was too personal for their business conversation, but she decided to ignore it. "It's part of my job," she replied in an even voice. Mark grinned and leaned forward slightly. "Still, I think there's something unexpected about you." He paused, then added, "I'm rarely wrong about people, Sarah." Her heart thumped faster, but she didn't let herself show it. Instead of answering, she closed the folder and rose from her chair. "We'll continue this conversation when you've made a decision that won't jeopardize your assets," she said sternly. But just as she was about to leave, Mark took a step toward her. "I'm not trying to pressure you." His voice was almost a whisper, "but I'm sure you know how talented you are." Sarah felt his words pierce through her. He didn't take his eyes off her, and it made her feel uncomfortable. She walked quickly out of the office, trying to focus on work, but even in the car she couldn't get this conversation out of her head. When she opened the door at home, Jack, who was sitting in the living room with his laptop, looked at her through the screen. His look was concerned, but he didn't say anything. "You're back late," he remarked quietly as he closed the laptop. "Business," Sarah replied briefly, avoiding the details. She quickly took off her shoes and walked to the kitchen, opening the refrigerator in search of something cold. Jack stood up and walked over to her. "You look exhausted. Is everything okay?" "Yeah," she answered without looking at him. "Just a long day." He watched her carefully as she slowly drank the water. Her tension was almost palpable. "Are you sure?" She met his gaze and nodded, then hurried upstairs. But behind the closed bedroom door, her thoughts returned to Mark. His confidence, the way he spoke, the moment when he'd gotten too close. Over the next few days, her meetings with Mark became regular. He no longer made outright remarks, but his attention seemed focused on her rather than on his finances. When he invited her to lunch, Sarah accepted because it was part of her duties. But she noticed her own reaction to him becoming more and more confused. At one meeting, he came closer to her than he should have to show her a document on his phone. "You work so hard, Sarah. What? Isn't it time to allow yourself some freedom?" She pretended she didn't know what he was talking about. "I work for a living, Mark. Isn't that what you do?" "Oh, I'm good at it." He gave her a look that took her breath away. Meanwhile, Jack was spending more and more time working from home. His new software development for a client required full concentration, but he couldn't ignore the strange feeling that something had changed in their home. Sarah was close by, but it was as if something was distancing her. Once, as he passed her bag left in the hallway, he noticed a document with Mark's company logo on it. He'd never meddled in her affairs, but this time he decided to look into the details. What he saw made him wonder why Sarah was working with a client who was rumored to be more interested in her advisors than their recommendations. The following Friday, Mark invited Sarah to a private party for business associates. She hesitated, but decided it might be good for her career. "Don't be long," Jack said as she walked out. His voice was calm, but there was anxiety in it. "I won't be long," Sarah replied, avoiding his gaze. She didn't know how to explain to him why she wanted to look a little better than usual, why her choice of dress this evening had taken longer than usual. When she entered the hall, Mark was already waiting for her. His eyes sparkled when he saw her and he took a step forward to greet her. "Sarah, you look dazzling." She allowed herself to smile, feeling a slight warmth from his words. But in spite of her determination to keep a stern demeanor, she knew in her heart that something important had already begun to change. The room where the party was being held was drenched in luxury. Marble columns reflected the soft light of expensive chandeliers, and subtle music filled the space, creating an atmosphere of elite comfort. Sarah, feeling slightly uncomfortable, stepped inside. She was already regretting her decision to come, but Mark was immediately at her side as if he had been expecting her. "Sarah, you're gorgeous," he said, barely concealing his admiration. "Thank you," she said with restraint, avoiding his eyes. He took her elbow lightly and led her to the bar. "You're too tense. Tonight is the night to relax. None of us are at work." Sarah clutched the clutch in her hands, her movements nervous. She accepted the champagne glass from his hands, trying to remain calm. There was lively conversation around them, men laughing, women casting wary glances in Mark's direction. He seemed to feel like the master of everything that was going on. "Tell me, Sarah," he began, taking a small sip from his glass, "don't you ever wish you could just let things go?" She raised an eyebrow. "Let go of what?" "Everything. The rules, the restrictions, the expectations. Sometimes it's so nice to be yourself, unencumbered by boundaries." Sarah felt her heart race. There was something hypnotic in his voice. She took a sip of champagne, trying to calm her inner tension. "Sometimes," she said finally, avoiding his gaze. Mark smiled. "Then why not start tonight?" Her thoughts were racing. She looked for a way to change the subject, but at that moment Laura, Mark's wife, came up to them. She looked flawless. Long black dress, perfectly styled, confidence in every move. "Oh, is this the Sarah?" Laura asked, as if they were talking about her behind her back. Sarah tensed. "Yes, Laura." "Meet Sarah, this is Sarah, my top counselor," Mark said, not letting go of Sarah's elbow. "Nice to meet you, Sarah," Laura said, looking at her intently. Her tone was cold but polite. Mark, as if nothing had happened, continued, "You know, Sarah, Laura always says I'm too busy working. But sometimes even work can be a real pleasure when you're around people like you." Sarah didn't know how to respond. She could feel Laura's gaze on her, sharp, penetrating. She wanted to leave, but her legs felt like they were stuck to the ground. "Laura, let me take Sarah to our partners. Do you mind?" Mark said without waiting for her answer. Laura grinned. "Of course not, darling. I'm sure you'll have a wonderful time." As they stepped away, Sarah turned to Mark. "That was strange. She's used to my business connections." "Don't worry," he replied as he continued to lead her through the hall. He stopped at a small table where 3 people were standing, a famous director, a financier, and an actress whose face Sarah had seen on the posters. Mark introduced her as the main man in his business. She nodded, trying to regain her confidence. "Sarah, you're not only smart, you're also incredibly beautiful," one of the men said suddenly, which caused the others to laugh. Mark didn't smile. He only tilted his head slightly and said, "She is much more than beautiful." Those words caught Sarah off guard. She tried to concentrate on the conversation, but the atmosphere became increasingly tense. Meanwhile, Jack was at home with Alex, helping him with a project for school. But in his mind he was far away. Too much had changed in the last few months and it was keeping him busy. When Sarah left, he noticed her phone left on the kitchen counter. Normally he never touched her things, but something this time made him glance at the screen. There were no notifications, but one of the open tabs made him wary. A detailed profile of a client, Mark Steele. Jack sat down at his desk, opened his laptop, and began searching for information about Mark. Soon he found several photos from recent events that showed Mark in the company of beautiful women, clearly not his wife among them. Jack felt anger slowly building up inside. When Alex went to bed, Jack was still sitting at his computer, studying everything he could find about Mark. His tension was rising. Was it his paranoia? Or was something really starting to fall apart in their lives? At the party, Sarah felt like the situation was getting out of control. She tried several times to apologize and leave, but Mark found a way to keep her close each time. His jokes, his way of looking at her, it all left her confused. When she went to the bar for another glass of champagne, Laura reappeared. "My husband seems to like you," she said, pretending it was a joke. Sarah didn't know what to say. "I'm just doing my job," she replied, trying to keep her composure. Laura smiled. "I hope so. But believe me, if it were otherwise I would know." Laura walked away, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts. At that moment, Mark reappeared beside her. "Is everything all right?" he asked, looking at her. "Yes, of course," she replied, trying to force a smile. "Sarah, you don't look relaxed. Let me show you something that will definitely lift your spirits." he said and took her hand. She wanted to refuse but somehow she couldn't. Her heart was racing and she followed him, not knowing where it would lead. Sarah followed Mark through the crowd of guests as if on autopilot. She felt slightly dizzy, perhaps because of the champagne, or maybe because of the rattling mixture of anxiety and excitement he was awakening in her. They climbed the wide staircase to the second floor, where the noise of the party was fading, giving way to the soft whisper of closed doors and the dim light of a long hallway. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice a little louder than she wanted it to be. Mark turned around, his smile was enchanting, but there was a subtle danger in it. "There's a room in here that I always show to people I'm interested in. You'll like it," he said as if that explained everything. His words hurt her. She felt a wave of involuntary tension run through her body. "Mark, I don't think this is a good idea. I've already stayed longer than I'd planned." He stopped, looked at her and bowed his head slightly. "If you want to leave, I won't keep you. But I think you should see this." Sarah hesitated. His words sounded like a challenge and deep down she knew she wouldn't leave. Her curiosity, mixed with something deeper, made her step behind him. Mark opened the massive wooden door and the study opened before her, a large room with panoramic windows that overlooked the city at night. Shelves of books, an antique desk, leather armchairs. In the center of the room hung a painting, huge, bright, depicting a raging sea. The light of the lamps was soft on its surface, accentuating the riot of colors. "This is my favorite room," Mark said, gesturing for her to enter. Sarah walked forward tentatively, looking around. The room seemed intimate but not in a defiant way, more like a place where a person reveals his or her true nature. "Why did you show me this place?" she asked, turning toward him. Mark closed the door and slowly stepped closer. "Because I want you to understand what is important to me. This is where I make life-changing decisions." His words sounded like something more than just a statement. Sarah felt the tension in the air become almost palpable. "Mark," she began, trying to find the right words, but he interrupted her. "You know, Sarah, you're not like the others. You're smart, honest, strong. I can see that. And you deserve more than just running around in the circle your life keeps you in." "I don't think you know what's holding me back," she replied, her voice sounding firmer than she expected. He grinned and took another step forward. "Do you? Then tell me, Sarah, what's holding you back? What keeps you from being who you want to be?" Her heart beat faster. She couldn't look away from his eyes. For a split second she thought he was going to touch her. And then her phone vibrated in her bag, breaking the tense pause. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, stepping back and pulling out her phone. A name popped up on the screen, Jack. She felt her face flush. "Do you need to get that?" Mark asked calmly, not moving from his seat. "Yes, this is my husband," she said, bringing the phone to her ear. She could hear Jack talking on the other end of the line, but her thoughts were somewhere here in this room with Mark. "Sarah, are you there?" Jack's voice was a little wary. "Yeah, I'm here." "Sorry, it's just noisy," she replied, trying to put a normal tone to her voice. "Are you going to be home soon? Alex fell asleep and I thought you were probably just finishing up." "Yeah, I'll be home soon." "I need a little more time," she said, glancing at Mark, who was looking at her with a slight smile. "Okay. Be careful," Jack said before hanging up. Sarah tucked the phone back into her bag, her fingers trembling. "Is your husband worried?" Mark asked, crossing his arms over his chest. "He just cares about me," she replied. "And that's good. But Sarah, let me tell you one thing. You are so much more than just a wife and mother. You are an amazing woman and I will not let you forget that." Sarah took a step back toward the door. "Mark, thank you for your compliment, but I really have to go." His face remained calm, but there was disappointment in his eyes. "Of course, Sarah. I didn't want to keep you." She turned and walked quickly out of the room, her heart racing. She walked downstairs, avoiding the stares of the guests, and headed for the exit. Her car was parked in the parking lot and she struggled to start the engine, feeling her fingers trembling on the steering wheel. When she got home, Jack was sitting on the couch, holding a mug of coffee. "How was the party?" he asked, his voice steady but his gaze wary. "Good. A little tiring, but it went okay," she replied, taking off her coat. He looked at her carefully. "You look tense." "Just tired, Jack. I've had a long day." He nodded but didn't say anything. Sarah quickly went upstairs, feeling her heart still unable to slow down. In the bathroom, she looked at her reflection in the mirror. Her face was red, her eyes glistening. She remembered how close Mark had gotten, how his words seemed to get under her skin. She knew this was wrong. Knew her life with Jack had been her rock. But then why had this strange, inexplicable excitement awakened in her? Meanwhile, Jack was sitting downstairs holding his phone. He looked at the picture of Mark he'd found online and thought about the fact that his wife had spent time at a party with this man. Something about him kept Jack on edge. Perhaps it was instinct, perhaps it was jealousy. But he could feel that something was beginning to change. Jack sat in the darkness of the living room, his face lit only by the laptop screen. He was looking again at the pictures of Mark Steele he'd found a few days ago. There were more of them than he had expected. In each picture, Mark looked as if the world had been made for him. A white-toothed smile, expensive suits, surrounded by beautiful women and powerful people. In these shots he saw the charisma he guessed Sarah hadn't told him about, but which could certainly charm her. The door upstairs creaked open. Jack quickly closed the laptop. Sarah, coming down barefoot, stopped in the living room doorway. Her silhouette looked fragile in the soft light of the street lamps filtering through the blinds. "Are you still awake?" she asked, her voice quiet but alert. "I can't sleep," Jack answered, pushing back the mug of tea that had long since cooled. "What?" Sarah stepped closer, her gaze heavy, as if she knew Jack had noticed something but didn't want to confirm it. "Just thoughts," he answered evasively. She sighed and sank to the edge of the couch. Her gaze drifted to the dark window. "You work too much. I should take a vacation," she said, avoiding his gaze. "It's not work," Jack cut her off. "It's us." Her breath hitched for a second. She finally turned to him. "Us? What do you mean?" she asked, but her voice shook. "You know what I mean, Sarah." His voice was calm but cold. "Tell me honestly, what is it between you and Mark?" Sarah looked at him with wide eyes, her hand automatically reaching for the chain around her neck. The gesture gave her away more than her words. "Nothing," she said quickly, but her voice didn't sound confident enough. "We're just working together. He's my client." "Are you working with him or flirting with him?" Jack asked sharply, getting up from the couch. His voice was louder than he wanted it to be, but he couldn't stop now. "Jack, this is absurd," she replied, but her face turned red. "You're accusing me of flirting with a client? That's ridiculous. Then why have you changed so much? Why do you come home so aloof?" His voice sounded like a tightrope ready to snap. "And don't pretend I'm making this up." Sarah jumped up. "It's because I'm tired. Work is exhausting, and at home you're just looking for reasons to blame me. I just need peace, not these constant interrogations." Jack clenched his fists, trying to hold back his anger. But something in her words sounded like an excuse, not a protest. "I know what he means to you. I can see it. You don't even try to hide it." His voice was quieter, but that made it even sharper. "If you want to leave, just say so. You don't have to play these games." Sarah turned away, her shoulders shaking. She clung to the back of the couch as if it were the only thing keeping her from falling. "I don't want to leave, Jack," she said, her voice barely audible. "You and Alex are all I have." "Then why do you let him be a part of our lives?" he asked, stepping closer. "You don't even realize what you're doing, do you?" Sarah turned sharply toward him. "You want to know?" "Okay. Yes, he flirted with me. But I didn't do anything. I didn't respond to it. All I ever thought about was us, our family." Her words sounded like thunder, shattering the silence in the room. Jack looked at her, his face grim, but his eyes showed a storm of emotion. "And you think that's enough?" he finally asked, his voice almost a whisper. "That we can just ignore what's already starting to destroy us?" Sarah took a step back, her eyes filling with tears. "I didn't mean for things to get like this, Jack. I don't know how it happened." Her voice shook and she covered her face with her hands. Jack stood silent, his heart pounding frantically. He wanted to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. The next day, as if by default, they avoided talking. Sarah had gone to work earlier than usual, and Jack had stayed home, picking Alex up from school. But the silence between them seemed too loud to ignore. In the afternoon, Jack received a notification on his phone, a message from a friend who worked in security. It was a report on Mark's financial activities. Nothing illegal, but several investments were downright risky. And they all coincided with projects Sarah was overseeing. He felt his anxiety turn into a keen sense of danger. Jack's mind was running through a plan. He needed to find out what else this man was hiding. Sarah, meanwhile, stood in the conference room where Mark and several of his colleagues were discussing a new project. Her thoughts were wandering. She tried to concentrate, but Mark's gaze kept catching her attention. After the meeting, he approached her as if he knew in advance that she wouldn't say no. "Sarah, we're going to make this work. Don't doubt it," he said, putting his hand on her shoulder. She backed away quickly. "Thank you, Mark. But I have to go now." He smirked, and there was something in his eyes that made her feel vulnerable. "We both know this isn't just a job, Sarah," he said. Her heart sank, but she turned abruptly and walked away without a word. Jack spent the evening checking Sarah's laptop, which she had left in the kitchen. In her mail he found several letters from Mark. They seemed businesslike at first, but one message stood out. "Sarah, if you ever decide to take a step toward your freedom, know I'm always here for you." Those words burned him. He closed the laptop and clenched his fists. Something inside him snapped and he realized he wasn't going to let this man destroy their family. Jack woke up at dawn as if his body had sensed the alarm before his brain even woke up. Sarah was still asleep. Her face, partially hidden behind shadows, looked calm, but Jack knew there was a storm lurking beneath that mask. They had barely spoken the last few days. Silence filled the space between them like an invisible barrier. He got out of bed, trying not to wake her, and walked out of the bedroom. Waiting for him in the kitchen was the laptop he'd checked last night. Jack turned it on, feeling his heart quicken its rhythm. He opened Sarah's email, scrolling through his correspondence with Mark. He knew it was wrong, but the feeling that he had to protect his family outweighed any moral qualms. Another letter caught his attention. It was received late at night, when Sarah was already asleep. "Sarah, I know how you feel. This is more than just a business relationship. You deserve to be happy. I'll be waiting for your decision. Mark." Jack closed the laptop abruptly. His hands were shaking. He couldn't figure out what exactly made him angrier, the fact that Mark was trying to pry into their lives, or the fact that Sarah didn't seem to put a stop to it. When Sarah woke up, she sensed something subtly different in the house. Jack was in the living room, tucked away on his phone, but his posture was tense. She knew she couldn't put off the conversation any longer. "Good morning," she said, trying to sound calm. Jack looked up. His eyes, usually soft, were now cold and wary. "Good morning," he said in a flat tone. "We need to talk." Sarah felt her insides tighten. She sat down across from him, her hands nervously fumbling with the hem of her robe. "About what?" she asked, even though she already knew the answer. Jack was silent for a few seconds before he put the phone down on the table. His voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. "You said nothing was going on. But you keep letting that man cross the line." Sarah froze. She didn't know what to say. Jack leaned forward. "Why aren't you doing anything, Sarah? Why haven't you put a stop to it? Or is that the way you like it?" His voice was cold but not loud, and that scared her more than anything. She started, but her voice shook. "I just didn't know how to deal with it." "I tried." "You didn't? You let him think he had a chance. You didn't even close the door for him, Sarah," Jack interrupted. Her eyes filled with tears. She jumped up, unable to bear his gaze, and went to the window. She stood there looking out at the street, but saw only her reflection. "I would never do that, Jack." "Never?" she whispered. He stood up, his footsteps quiet but determined. He walked toward her, standing behind her back, not touching her. "But you let him think you could. And that's already a problem." Sarah turned back to him. Her face was wet with tears, but there was determination in her eyes. "I want you to know that this doesn't mean anything. I won't let him ruin what we have." Jack stared at her in silence. His eyes flashed with the emotion he was trying to hide. He took a deep breath. "Then tell him. Tell him that nothing is going to happen between you two. And end it." Sarah nodded. She knew there was no other way out. But her voice trembled when she answered, "I'll do it." The next day, after a long day at work, Sarah dialed Mark's number. She tapped her fingers nervously on the desk, listening to the dial tone. When he answered, his voice was as confident and calm as ever. "Sarah, I'm glad you called," he said. "We need to talk," she replied. "Of course. When?" he asked, as if he was sure the conversation would go in his favor. "Now," Sarah said firmly. It wouldn't take long. She met him at a cafe near the office. Mark was already waiting for her, sitting at a corner table. When she approached, he stood up to greet her, but she didn't allow herself to smile. "Mark, let's get right to it," she said, sitting down across from him. His smile faded, but he quickly regained his calm expression. "Okay. What did you want to talk about?" Sarah took a deep breath, trying to contain the tremor in her voice. "This has to end. Everything that's going on between us has to end. I'm not going to let my job or my family suffer because of it." Mark looked at her carefully. His face remained calm, but a shadow of disappointment flickered in his eyes. "I never meant to ruin your life, Sarah. He began, but she interrupted him. "No, Mark. It's not up for discussion. I respect my family and my marriage. And if you really respect me, you'll put this behind you." A tense silence hung between them for a few seconds. Then Mark nodded. "Okay. If that's what you want." Sarah stood up. Thank you for your understanding, Mark. Good luck to you. She left without waiting for an answer. Her heart was pounding frantically, but she felt better. She knew it was the right thing to do. When she got home, Jack was waiting for her. He looked at her in silence, waiting for an explanation. Sarah approached him, her gaze filled with honesty. It's done. I told him it was over. Jack looked at her carefully, his gaze softening. He stepped closer, taking her hand gently. I want to believe you, Sarah. But we need time. She nodded. Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of relief. She knew they still had a chance. Sarah lay on the bed, looking up at the ceiling where the moonlight cast strange shadows. She knew that talking to Mark was only part of the solution. The pain she'd caused Jack couldn't be erased with one encounter. Her mind battled between the fear of losing him forever and the hope that they still had a future. The next day, she decided to take the first step toward repairing their marriage. Sarah got up early, made breakfast, and woke Jack with a light touch on his shoulder. He opened his eyes and their gazes met. Good morning, she said softly. Morning, he replied, smiling weakly, but her gesture didn't go unnoticed. I made your favorite omelet. I think we should talk calmly without tension, she added, trying to keep the warmth in her voice. Jack sat up on the bed and nodded. His gaze was tired, but there was a spark of trust in it. They ate in silence, but the silence was different than before. There was no hostility, only caution. Sarah was the first to break the silence. I know it's hard for you to trust me after everything. And I understand why. But I want to fix everything I've ruined. Jack, holding his fork in his hand, looked at her carefully. I want to believe you, Sarah. But I need time. It's not as easy as you think. I know, she replied. And I'm willing to wait as long as it takes. He nodded, but said nothing more. Meanwhile, Mark was not going to give up. His certainty that Sarah would return sooner or later kept him going. A week after their conversation, he sent her a message. I miss seeing you. I know you feel the same way. If you change your mind, I'm always here for you. Sarah felt anger boiling up inside her. She realized that Mark was using every loophole to get back into her life. She couldn't afford to keep quiet. She showed the message to Jack before she could change her mind. It's from him, she said, looking him in the eye. I want you to know that I haven't responded and I don't intend to. Jack read the message, his face remaining still. He took a deep breath, then met her gaze. Thank you for telling me. He stood up and walked to the window where he stood looking out at the street for a long time. I want to talk to him, he finally said. Sarah froze. Jack, there's no need for that. I can handle it. No, he said firmly. I have to make sure he doesn't come into our lives again. The next day, Jack stood in front of the glass door of Mark's office. His heart was racing, but he felt it was necessary. As he entered, the receptionist looked up. What can I do for you? I need to speak to Mr. Steele. It's urgent. His tone left no room for objection. A few minutes later, Mark came out into the reception area, a surprised smile on his face. Jack, what a surprise. To what do I owe the pleasure? Jack wasted no time. We need to talk. They went into the office. Mark pointed to a chair, but Jack remained standing. You need to leave my wife alone, Jack said, his voice menacingly calm. Mark grinned and sat down on the edge of the table. Sarah is a grown woman. If she wants to hang out with me, that's her choice, isn't it? She's already made a choice. And it's not you, Jack said, taking a step closer. If you try to interfere in our lives again, I won't be so patient. Mark squinted, his smile gone. Are you threatening me? No, Jack said, his voice even quieter. I'm just warning you. Mark remained silent and Jack turned to leave. But he stopped before he left. You're used to getting your way, but not this time. It's over. When Jack got home, Sarah was waiting for him at the door. She rushed toward him, her eyes filled with concern. Have you spoken to him? Yes, he answered, stepping into the house. And he understood. She hugged him, her arms wrapped tightly around his neck. Thank you, Jack. He pulled away slowly, looked into her eyes and said, It's up to us now, Sarah. We have to work together to fix this. She nodded. I'm ready. Over the next weeks, their lives began to change. They talked more, tried to make time for each other. Jack began to trust Sarah again, and she did her best to build that trust. Their relationship was no longer the same, but there was something new in it, a realization of how easy it was to lose everything and how important it was to fight for what really mattered. One evening, sitting on the terrace looking up at the stars, Sarah took Jack's hand. You know, I thought we were going to lose each other, she said. Me too, he replied. But we're still here. And that's what matters. They sat in silence, feeling their bond slowly but surely being restored. Even though there was a long road ahead, They knew they were ready to walk it together. And that concludes our story today. Thank you for watching to the end. If you liked it, please give it a like and leave a comment. Also, we are always happy to discuss any comments you may have. See you in the next video.